As possibly one of the most anticipated games of the year, The Last of Us II has finally arrived after months of delay. Adam here from HDTVtest, and in this video I'm going to do a little analysis of some of the earlier scenes in the game. I'm going to try and keep away from spoilers. Most of the footage is from the first chapter or the first couple of hours of gameplay. We will take a look at the settings, give you a breakdown of what they do and how you may choose to use them. This is Naughty Dog's first full-length game since the HDR era of video games really began back in 2016. With their previous attempts at retrofitting an HDR grade into Uncharted 4 and The Last of Us, both worked with mixed success. Typically looking brighter than is to be expected, often a little washed out and sometimes so extremely contrasty it was actually hard to see. I'd be keen to see how The Last of Us 2 shaped up in this regard, as its visuals were looking to be in line with the original's heavily compressed image that tries to preserve highlight detail and avoid overexposure, while simultaneously presenting detail in dark areas. A typical Hollywood-style filmic look that we also see in games that are aping Hollywood also, like Red Dead Redemption 2. So let's take a look at some heat maps, and the game doesn't appear to operate within a fixed container as such. Changing settings in the photo mode and in the settings menu actually allowed me to adjust the image all the way up to the full 10,000 nits of PQ. With the game on the default settings, however, the vast majority of scenes in the game fall well within 1000 nits, with the game floating around and below 100 nits in cutscenes, reserving upper brightness for light sources. These cutscenes look in line in what we would expect to see in an HDR graded movie. If we pick some of these crowd-pleasing sunset sequences, the highlights and the sun itself track to over 2000 nits. The game doesn't appear to have a fixed upper value or ceiling that's adjustable. Highlight preservation falls onto the display to be handled. I wondered if the PS4's own OS settings may be able to take effect here. After all, a simple 1D LUT is all it would take to control these highlights if the game wasn't doing it. Weirdly, we have another first-party Sony game that doesn't make use of any of these settings at all. Presumably because, again, like Death Stranding a few months back, the game doesn't feature a display mapper which can read these settings. In reality, it's not really a problem due to the game clearly being exposed and tweaked to function correctly. You are unlikely to see any clipping in places where it's not welcome. As most displays do feature a roll-off by default or by changing a setting, this is pretty manageable. Let's pop into the video options and take a look there. We do have a couple of super basic controls to play with: brightness and contrast. The same slightly awkward setup that we see in God of War and Destiny 2. As described, the default setting is going to give great results for most people, so you may just want to leave it all alone. The values are labelled a little bit back to front if you ask me, the opposite of what you would see in your TV settings. Brightness controls the white point, allowing you to pump up the brightness, moving closer to that 10,000 nits or lower down from the values that I was seeing, brightening the whole image except for 0 black. Contrast moves the black point and allows you to lift black or crush it, decrease it to lift the black. This is useful if you're playing in a more well-lit environment and you're struggling to see. Slightly annoyingly, the images at the top of the screen here don't actually reflect the dynamic range that you see in-game, so they don't actually help much in terms of adjusting the image. For the most part, everything looks good, but I did come across a few areas early in the game where the image did appear to be a little bit too bright. This overcast evening sky was glowing like daylight in some places, and the world light sources appeared to be drowned out by this, effectively changing the appearance of what should have felt like evening and making it look more like daytime. This may just be a rogue area in the game that needs further tweaking by Naughty Dog, or it may be an area that highlights an expansion from an SDR base upwards to HDR. So when I'm looking at this with my eyes, I'm testing this on an LG C9, and if I'm seeing this here on a display that has very limited brightness capabilities, I suspect that this over-brightening may be even more prevalent on other brighter scenes in the game, or if you're using a display with a much greater full field capability. Outside of capturing for this video, I think I would personally choose to play the game with the brightness option turned down a little actually, -2 or -3. This just helps to dial back the upper mid bright areas a little, and it makes this phenomenon a little less pronounced. Interestingly, you can see in the photo mode what some of the base settings they've used are, and it already looks like they've tried to tune the brightness a little bit downwards in this direction. Trying to produce a piece of video game content that both looks good and is entirely playable is a challenge for many HDR games. So what we are seeing could simply be a usability tweak. The game features lots of dark to light transitions both on loading screens and in many of the game's environments. And all of these gradients are a real stress test for banding and near black handling. If you're seeing black crush or banding, then this is likely a product of your display rather than the game itself, which actually does a really fantastic job of handling the banding through various temporal filtering, motion blurring techniques, and a really well-designed film grain effect, which, much like a real-life film camera or a digital sensor, is noisier in darker tones. Trying to separate out the impact of the HDR from a game that already looks so incredible is actually pretty tough. And I do feel that the current implementation, whilst not perfect, does what it's supposed to do. Preserves the traditional look of a movie, which is clearly an artistic objective of the series. It expands the dynamic range, it increases the shadow details, and it creates moments of increased realism, of increased naturalism, or impact through a more lifelike range of colours and dynamic range. And that is particularly interesting in a game that is actually quite stylized. It at times looks like a graphic novel almost. So to actually be able to marry these things up together, they've done a really great job. With this in mind, I'm going to do something that I've been thinking about for a while with these game videos. I'm going to actually give The Last of Us 2 a rating for its HDR implementation. The score it receives is 4 out of 5. It offers more to players than the SDR mode. It functions well throughout and has some basic adjustments that lets you try and adjust to your taste and your viewing environment. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and come follow me on Twitter for more of this type of information. Thanks again. Bye-bye.